Good evening. I'm Professor Pat Murphy, and I'd like to welcome you to the final Berges lecture for 2010. I'd like to start by recognizing Jack Berges and his daughter Ann sitting here, whose name the series holds. Jack, you and Ann have been very faithful attendees this fall. It's great to see you. And I also like to recognize Marilyn's assistant, Deb Cundy, who's hiding over here in the wings, for all of her hard work in making tonight possible. So it's my pleasure to introduce Marilyn Carlson Nelson to you. She's chairman and former CEO of Carlson, which includes such brands as Radisson Hotels, Country Inn and Suites, Carlson, Wagonlit Travel, and TGI Fridays. More than 150,000 people work under the Carlson brands in 150 countries. Marilyn has appeared in Forbes magazine's list of the world's 100 most powerful women. Also, U.S. News and World Report has named her one of America's best leaders. This year, she was recognized by the Co-Roundtable for her outstanding citizenship. In 2004, she co-chaired the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland. She served as chair of the National Women's Business Council, bipartisan advisory council to the President and Congress, and as past chair of the U.S. Travel and Tourism Advisory Board. She serves on the boards of ExxonMobil, the Committee for Encouraging Corporate Philanthropy, the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, and is also chair of the Mayo Clinic Board of Trustees. She's a graduate of Smith College and is teaching a course on corporate responsibility for MBA students at the University of Minnesota. She's author of best-selling book, How We Lead Matters, Reflections on a Life of Leadership, and that's the title for her talk this evening. Please join me in giving me a Notre Dame welcome to Marilyn Carlson Nelson. There's water on the podium.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. After listening to all that, you won't believe that one of the chapters in my book is about gerbils, but I won't tell you about it because you're all going to get a book and you'll have to read it yourselves because I'm a little embarrassed about it, but I'll tell you later. Okay, thank you, Professor Murphy. Thank you for doing this with these lectures. I wish I were here to hear the others. I don't always learn that much until the questions and answers when I'm the speaker. I've never been on this campus before, and it's beautiful. I envy you all. My name is Carlson Nelson, so you figured out that I'm Swedish. So that's kind of, I'm a little closer to the Vikings than to the Fighting Irish. Yeah, I have to admit that. But I also have to tell you that one of my good friends is Lou Holtz. And I don't know, has he ever delivered this message? I know he delivers lectures because one of the things I was thinking about was when I asked him, I was chairing the United Way, and he came to be a speaker at the time before you all recruited him away, and he was at Minnesota for a while, a very short while. But he came to Minnesota, and we had lost for like 3 seasons. We had a string of losses. And he won a game before he could recruit anyone, before he could change the personnel or anything else. And so he and I were on the podium for this United Way event, and I said, I don't get it. How come we've had so many coaches, we've lost for so many seasons? I mean, what's your secret? How could you take the same team and you could win? And he said, it's easy. It's the same thing you do in life that you do on the field. And he said, and that's what you should do in your corporation, and if you do, you're going to be winning. I said, okay, what's that? He said, just tell everybody, do your best, do what's right, and do unto others. That was his formula. So here I am, preparing to talk to you about ethical leadership, and I'm going to be talking about personal accountability. Probably you could say that's do your best. I'm going to be talking about the common good, working in teams, thinking about the other guy. Yeah, you could probably say that's do unto others. And I'm going to be talking a lot about integrity, which is something I know you talk a lot about on this campus. But let me tell you, they don't talk about it as much on every campus. And you are blessed to be in a place where this is something that everyone understands is the foundation of who we are, what we contribute, and what difference we're going to make. So, in a sense, do what's right, do your best, and do unto others. So I could exit, but since I'm here to give the speech, I won't do it. But I'll tell you that a little bit quickly about my book. I'm what you call an accidental author. People say to me, was it really hard writing a book? And the funny thing is, no, it wasn't, because I didn't expect to publish it. He's actually 16 now, but when my grandson, my eldest grandson, second grandson, was 12, he came to me and said, they call me Mame. He said, Mame, were you alive during segregation? I thought he must mean the Civil War. And I was a little offended. But then I thought about it again. And I thought, no, he's obviously thinking about the 60s. And the fact is, not only was I alive, but that was when I came out of school. And that was when I started to try to get a job. And that was before women could own property, before women could get a loan without their son or their father or their brother signing for them. It was before women had opportunities on campuses that were equal to men. And so he was right. I was a kind of an artifact that he should interview to find out a little bit about what had changed and what was happening. But what I decided was that I needed to tell him not only about what I'd fought for and what I believe in, but that I wanted all my grandchildren, and their grandchildren for that matter, to know me a little bit better. And this is a message for all of you, because my great-grandmother left me her poetry books, or at least I got them through the chain, and they're beautiful leather books, and they don't have a mark in them, because I'm sure we can remember, they told us, you don't defile a book by writing in it. Well, the sad thing is, today I could go on the internet and access any one of those poems. And if she had written anything in it, I would have treasured it. It would have been a message to me. If she had underlined something, I would have felt like this line meant something to her. What was going on in her life that this meant something to her? So I decided for my grandchildren only to start just reminiscing about little stories. Some of them might be stories when I was raising my family. Some might be stories when I was entertaining Gorbachev, or when the KGB came for a picnic, or when I went to China and I worked with Madame Chan, and we became really dear friends, and we kind of forgot that we never spoken to each other in a common language, that we'd always spoken with interpreters, but we somehow, through the joy of business, we came together and we became dear friends. And I wanted them to know about these moments and these people who had taught me a little bit about leadership, about how we lead. Not just do we win, but how do we win, and how do we lead our lives? So when Deb and I were traveling, she was with me, some of our other corporate executives, because we were working to open Asia, and it's hours to get there. And so on the way home, often we were tired, and it was so much fun for me, because that was the time I would start working on my thoughts for this, for what were just going to be a collection of things for my grandchildren. And then I sent it to someone to get an opinion of whether I should let our executives see it, because it's very heartfelt and very honest. And I wanted the grandchildren to know the good, the bad, and the ugly, because that's what life is all about. And I didn't want them to see pictures of me as a CEO and picture me at graduation or on the sidelines of a game and not realize the struggles and some of the hurts and some of the challenges. So I sent it off to what I thought was a really good friend in New York and said, you're outside of Minnesota. Tell me, I want this to stay personal. Do I dare share it with anyone? I'm public figure in Minnesota anyway, and I don't, how would I feel if this were made more public? And he was having lunch with McGraw-Hill and gave the stories to Herb Schaffner at McGraw-Hill. And he called and said, well, I've got great news for you. We've decided that it would be okay for you to share it, and McGraw-Hill wants to publish it. So send 10 more stories, and we'll have it done in time for Carlson's anniversary. And I panicked. I felt like somebody had stolen the keys to my diary. And I told my husband, I've got to start pulling these stories out. I can't tell someone. And he said, Marilyn, either you say no, and you don't do it, or you do it as honest and authentic as it is, as you want it to be for your children. Because if you think it's right for them, it will be right for others. So that's how come I ended up speaking around the country about various things that are in the book, about leadership, about accountability, about personal accountability, and about integrative thinking, learning to connect the dots in order to really lead better and work across sectors. And that's how come you're going to have the keys to my diary in your hands sooner or later. The topic that people seem to be wrestling with is, what are the demands of leadership with the way the world is now, in this sort of connected, always-on world? It's different. When my father started the company, he could go to a little town and try to make a pitch, make a sale, and if he didn't make the sale, he and his colleagues would get back in the car, they'd go have a cup of coffee, they'd change their sales pitch, they'd go to the next town, until they finally started selling and succeeding and got the right story. Today, I mean, it's so connected, it's just totally changed leadership and business. And the fact is, in the United States, there's not a lot of debate about all the challenges that we're facing, is there? We know that we have to stimulate job creation. Every community is worried about that. We need innovation desperately if the United States are going to keep our edge. And also, if we're going to contribute to the world and employ more people. We need to retool our education system. We're in a crisis around our education. We need to retool our health system. We need to preserve the environment. We need to combat terrorism. We need to work to alleviate poverty and disease. And we need to do all that with without such an enormous deficit. And the fact is, it's not possible. There's no one group that's in charge. It's not totally the government who can solve that problem. It's not totally the NGOs, no matter how well-meaning they are, and it's not totally business. But it's a little bit because those problems are so complex and so interconnected, and because our actions today have implications way beyond our immediate environments, and in some cases, our actions have implications even beyond our own time. Of course, the environment being an obvious one, that we're asking ourselves, what do we have to do to lead? And I hope you're asking yourselves that, because you, in fact, are the leaders, and you can't hand that off to someone else. It does matter how you lead. So asking yourself, how? What's the difference? What is leadership today? How do I work across sectors? How do I partner? How are we going to solve these complex problems? Those are great questions. And I have to tell you the truth, I love questions. I hope I still love them after you ask me some. But in any case, I really do love questions because they provoke a lot of thought. And I love poetry, as you heard, and I have a favorite poet, Rainer Maria Rilke, a German poet, wrote a lot in German, wrote some in French. The translations are good. And Rilke had this to say: try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms or books written in a foreign language. At present, you need to live the question. Perhaps you will gradually, even without noticing it, find yourself experiencing the answer some distant day. I had a really interesting question asked of me about a year ago. Mikhail Gorbachev had created this award ceremony for women, career awards in a whole group of different sectors. And I was there on behalf of business. But Mrs. Massoni, the woman who's been reinventing the design fashion house of Massoni, was there. We had the Nobel Peace Prizer, Betty Williams was there from Ireland. Queen Noor of Jordan was there. We had entertainers and international human rights activists, and they were all being recognized for their work. And it was a joyful, fabulous occasion, and it was very elegant. We had this beautiful dinner, and I was totally enthralled and excited and stimulated by all the people I was meeting. And suddenly this very sophisticated European gentleman, who I had heard was a very important power in business, leaned across the table and, believe it or not, unabashedly in front of everyone there, said, "So, Mrs. Nelson, do you really believe you can be successful in business and have integrity?" I just looked at him. And it was so clear to me that he didn't feel in any way embarrassed about that question. His assumption was that everyone at that table would agree that integrity was sort of passé, and that in today's world you couldn't win if you had to stick with your ethical approach. Well, I was taken aback because I've always felt so strongly what I think you must believe. I believe that business can be the greatest power for good in the world. Think about it. So many various organizations act within a national setting, a sovereign setting. Business, multinational business, operates globally. It funds philanthropy. It creates jobs, which I happen to believe are the best philanthropy there is. It actually stimulates innovation. It links people from across the world. I remember at one point when the world was just not getting along at all, and I was just fascinated because we owned a big cruise line, and we often had 30 different nationalities below decks working together, and they got along great. They had a common goal. We ran those ships. They cared about the customer. They got along fine, and I kept thinking, how come in a business setting so often we can have global teams and work well, and somehow we have a difficult time doing it in the political arena? So it seems to me that there's one clear lesson from the current crisis. And I think we've all seen it, haven't we? That without integrity, you won't be in business for long. Without integrity. So that was my answer to that gentleman. And I was determined not to let his question spoil my dinner. Well, it was a couple weeks later that I was living that question. And I kept going over it and over it in my mind. And I realized that I was really grateful for the question, because I suddenly realized that it offered me an opportunity to speak out and to speak back and to speak my piece. And it's the unasked question that often is the one that gets us in trouble, because it's the unasked question that gives us permission somehow to disregard how our choices, the choices that we're making in our professional and personal lives, impact on the common good. Take, for example, the current economic crisis. It's covered with the fingerprints of business leaders who made reckless and sometimes greedy decisions which had severe consequences, widespread consequences for us, not just in the United States where it originated, but in the remotest corners of the planet, where many of those who were left behind were finally beginning to get a toehold in their own economic empowerment. Not only didn't these business leaders care about the common good, they failed to protect the interests, in many cases, of their very own stakeholders, which was their job as leaders. Sometimes they acted solely in their own interest. It saddens me to say that far too often over the last decade, business leadership has let us down. So discouraged was I back in 2004 about the cultures at Enron and WorldCom that I composed a letter to my company's shareholders. We happen to be a private company. So our shareowners were my children and my nieces and nephews. And this is what I said. Dear shareholders, to my children, grandchildren, nephews, nieces, and family members to follow, we are emerging from a period in American business history in which obsessive desire for gain led many people to commit acts of fraud, both overt, for which some may find themselves deservedly in jail, and moral, which perhaps not technically against the law, were certainly against the common good. When you are making a difficult decision, ask yourself if this decision that you are about to make would show integrity. Would this decision show leadership? Would it show caring? And if you make this particular decision, will you be giving up on something that you should continue to fight for? These are indeed hard guidelines to follow when others around you are ignoring the rules and seem to be besting you. But you know this, their win will only be temporary. In the end, doing the right thing will always triumph. It has always been so. So I urge you to take this long view over one of expedience or convenience. This may seem like lofty and unrealistic advice, but it is what our company and our family's success have been built on for more than 70 years. Never forget that your role as a leader is to be a steward for future generations. Without going through a detailed primer in the cause of the current crisis, one factor that we know played a significant role was that everyone was somehow under the illusion that risk could be passed on to someone else. And that's not what a true leader does. Stanford Business School Dean Robert Joss has said, and I love this is his definition of a leader, and I hope you think about this and maybe take this with you. His definition of a leader is someone who takes full responsibility for an organization and changes it for the better. That's the key, I think, and changes it for the better. Somehow, whether you're leading a class, whether you're leading a work group, if you can take that responsibility and feel that when you finish, somehow it's better or stronger or better positioned, and you've taken responsibility. It's about being personally responsible. And that's a lesson that I learned at a very tender age. Actually, I wrote in the book about it because in some ways it's worth repeating. I learned from my dad, who was the entrepreneur and started our company, but we were on our way to church. And my dad was a salesman, and so we didn't go to church. We lived out in the country, but we didn't go to church in the country. We went to church downtown because the church was really big, and he said he wanted us to think that God was big, bigger than our neighborhood. So we went downtown to church, and I was in middle school. And on the way home, I was sitting in the back seat. My sister was next to me, and I felt kind of proud of myself. And I announced, I'm not going to go to Sunday school anymore. I'm going to go to the sanctuary and hear the sermon. And my dad said, "You what?" I said, "I'm going to come to the sanctuary with you." And I fully thought he was going to say, "You're so mature, obviously. Going to Sunday school is not for you." And he said, "You what?" And I said, "Dad, it's worthless. The boys are throwing spitballs, they're shooting things, some of the kids are coming in the front door, they're going out the back to the Dairy Queen. It's just a waste of time." He pulled over, he turned around, he had kind of short, fat fingers. He pointed his finger at me and he said, you're going to quit Sunday school? At that point, I sort of said, well, I thought I was. And my mother said, Kurt, leave her alone. And she started to cry, and my sister started to cry, and I started to cry, and we had this horrible family scene. And he just told all of us to be quiet, and he pointed that finger at me, and he said, if you don't like it, fix it. Well, of course, I just dissolved. I said, Dad, I'm 13. We go to this huge church downtown, and you're telling me to fix it. And then my mother started to defend me and so on. Well, when I got home, none of that made any difference. He sent me to my room. I had to make a list of all the ways to fix Sunday school. And my mother had to take me to church during the week. We met with the superintendent. He was a tall guy, Mr. McKinsey, I think was his name. And he looked down and he said, what is it? And of course I had to say, well, I'm here to fix Sunday school. And he was really great. He sort of taught me about change management too, because he didn't laugh at me. He just said, no kidding. He said, this is a blessing, right? He said, we've been really worried about that class. And he said, what do you think is wrong? And so I went through my list, and then he said, do you think anyone else feels this way? And I said, yes. I was pretty sure that I knew a couple of the other girls were. And he said, well, what about the guys? And I said, well, there's a chance that they're bored. And he said, that's what we were afraid of. Shall we call a couple of them? So, of course, he pulled together a group, and we redesigned Sunday school. And let me tell you, as long as I live, when I don't like something and I want to get out of there or retreat, I see that finger pointing at me, and I hear, if you don't like it, fix it. And I point mine at you. If you don't like it, fix it. We have a whole society who is so busy saying, what's the matter with them? Why don't they do something about that? Is he smart enough to do that? Why didn't he do this? Did he keep his promise? When we perhaps need to look back and say, okay, there's things that I can't change, but there's things I can. And stop worrying so much about what they aren't getting done and worry a little bit more about what we're getting done. When I retired as CEO, the dean of the Carlson School at the university and the Humphrey, we had a Center for Integrative Leadership where those two disciplines, the public policy folks and the business school folks, came together, asked if I would be willing to co-teach. I'm not an academic, but to co-teach a class. And the dean said that the fact was that increasingly, and this is probably true here too, that the students were asking for courses in corporate social responsibility. How should what is responsibility? What is ethics for a corporation or a corporate leader in today's world? So the questions that the MBA students were asking, and you probably are asking them as well, how will I balance the priorities of profit and responsibility to society? If I focus on the profit piece, my costs may go down, but the cost for society might go up. If society asks me to do too much, take care of poverty, illiteracy, HIV/AIDS, malaria, pollution, then my costs could go up. I might not be competitive, I might not generate a profit, I'll have to lay off people, and I can't be a contributor to the solutions to these problems. This is a highly complex dilemma that every one of you will need to grapple with during your business careers. And that certainly wasn't the case back when I was studying international economics myself. Right now, in those days, in the 70s, remember, that's when Milton Friedman proclaimed that business's only job was to make a profit. He made it easy. If all you had to do was focus on maximizing the profit, then your other stakeholders could fulfill other kinds of responsibilities. But today, thoughtful business leaders, those whom are more and more being held up as respected and admired, make decisions not just for this quarter or the next quarter. They're making decisions that quite possibly have an impact on generations for the future. The challenge is how to assess those opportunities, how to present value the return, And if the return is or isn't going to come to your organization, how do you deal with it within your planning and your thinking? As the former Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland reminds us, our job is to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In 1970, of course, business was not subject to the pressures of intense globalization, which ties the world's economic markets together in startling ways. Witness the sudden downturn in the economy when Greece's economy took a dive, and look what's been going on as recently as today with Ireland. In 1970, the ability of technology and social networking to coalesce activists and socially responsible investment communities wasn't as great an influencing factor on business strategy as it is today. In 1970, most of the focus was on shareholders. That was pretty straightforward, return of profit. Business leaders now are being asked to think in terms of stakeholders. The definition of a stakeholder is all those who are impacted by or have an impact on a business. The compact between business and society has clearly evolved since Friedman's proclamation. After all, if we tout the fact that business can be one of the greatest forces for good, we must also concede that if it's irresponsibly managed, it can be a destructive force. And there's one other important differentiator between now and 1970, and that is a growing group of business leaders who have demonstrated that it is possible, even desirable and defensible from a competitive standpoint, to find that place where a business can create shared value for both itself and society. Shared value, I don't know if any of you have seen any of work of Harvard professor Michael Porter. He started talking about this in 2006. He points out that the short-term performance pressures that companies face, he acknowledges that, and it's a fact, that rules out what he calls indiscriminate investments in social value creation. Driving to shared value is a process that can help us sort through the multitude of needs and the multiplicity of stakeholder passions so that a business can thoughtfully prioritize when and how to engage. Carlson, for example, is in travel and tourism. We were called upon to engage in the terrible global scourge of trafficking in children, sex trafficking in children, trafficking in children for labor purposes, servitude, slavery. It was easier for us, as horrible and abhorrent and dark as that subject is, it was more appropriate for us because we deal in cross-border, we deal with immigration, we deal with customs, we deal with movements of people. It was more consistent with who we are and our strategy for us to engage in that human rights, children's rights issue than for us to engage in something that had to do with HIV/AIDS, for example. We're not in the pharmaceutical business, we don't understand chemicals, we have no distribution system for that. So what Porter was saying is find the places that are consistent and that you have unique capabilities that you can address, and then actually see if you can create product that both solves a social problem and creates value. Well, I always have to laugh because, of course, my dad just said the whole secret to being an entrepreneur is you fill a need. Well, so General Mills is coming out with products that have less salt. There's a need. There's a health need in the country. There is a need for people to have whole grains, and Cheerios has worked hard at creating a product that help people to address a problem. So it's a shared value. There's a company called Ecolab. They have a new product called Aquanomics. It's an industrial laundry detergent detergent. It cleans just as well as their traditional detergent. They've worked for years on this. It allows laundries to reduce the washing temperature by 20 to 40 degrees, and it cuts the water usage in half. So the environment wins. The laundry, they're a supplier for us at Carlson and our hotels. We win. We take costs. We have less water to heat. Less water takes less time. And it's actually even at the same price, so we actually get a greater return. And Ecolab is gaining market share. It's a win-win-win. It's the building of shared value. The focus on business as a primary player in solving society's problems is a new phenomenon, in some part due to the fact that what society considers ethical can change over time. Friedman didn't just consider it bad business to use shareholder funds to engage in any activity that wasn't directly involved with what that manufacturing company was making, but he actually considered it unethical. I can just imagine how he would have bristled if he had been sitting next to me earlier this year on a panel about cross-sector leadership when someone in the audience asked a professor of business. It happened to have been from St. Thomas, so maybe there's something that they have in common with all of you. But someone said to this professor, exactly what is ethics? I'll never forget, he didn't miss a beat. He said, ethics is others. So concise, so clear. Do unto others. I've come to a really interesting conclusion, and maybe you've come to it too. We've built this country on individualism, and I respect that. My forefathers came from Sweden right about the time that the Irish were coming with the potato famine. They came for the American dream. They wanted to work hard. They had no access to capital. They came here to get capital, and I have so much respect for that. But we also have to remember that they weren't such rugged individuals that they didn't come together and build the churches and raise the barns and build their homes, their schools, and then their homes last. They knew about the common good. Isn't it time that somewhere we declare our interdependence? This world is so small. We need each other as never before. And we just have to watch what's happening here, even in our own capital. And hooray for the people who are starting to say, we are interdependent. We need each other. And then if we start from the premise that we can, if we're creative and collaborative, create win-win. I'm not sure my generation has done the best job of doing that, but I think you can. I think you're inclusive. I think you're working together across races, across genders. I think you're building on your faith and your integrity. You can do that. You can stop blaming someone else. You can acknowledge your interdependence. You can listen better. You can be creative, and you can deal with that. It makes me so much more hopeful because the need is so great. You're going to have to work across borders. If you're in business school, you've got to learn about public policy, and you've got to work with NGOs, and you've got to work with the government. The government, whether we like it or not, is playing an increasing large role in our lives. The regulations can change your business model. So you're going to have to work with others in your industry to either put personal discipline into the way you run your company so that you can avoid being regulated in certain areas, or you may have to take hands with others in your industry and your industry groups and try to be actively collaborating in Washington in the halls of power where regulations are being written. And you're going to have to actually, beyond that, work across national borders and work with the United Nations or with the World Bank and collaborate in order to find ways to create business models that you can afford to go into some of these very poor developing areas where you need to get a return for your share owners. They need you to be there to build the infrastructure, or to build the properties, or to bring jobs, but you can't do it without some collaboration with some global institution that wants to help you to make foreign direct investment that is actually going to pay back. I'm also hopeful because many business schools and management schools, including Notre Dame, have become signatories of the Principle for Responsible Management Education, which seeks to embed corporate responsibility into business education. I'm hopeful because you didn't ask me to come here to talk about how to craft a business deal, but you asked me to come and talk about ethics. And I'm also hopeful because you've probably been online, you probably know that at Thunderbird and at Harvard and at a whole group of universities, business school people have actually said, the doctors take an oath, the Hippocratic Oath, the legal students take some kind of oath. Why don't we create an oath of business so that we don't get painted with this brush and tainted with this terrible, terrible situation we have today where people don't trust business? So you heard my philosophy. The only place we can start is where we are. Start with the committees you're on, or start with the teams you're on, or start with the classes you're in, or when you go to the businesses, or when you're working. Start with where you are and hold yourselves responsible. There's a French philosopher, playwright, Voltaire. He says, cultivate your own garden. If we each do that, collectively we can make an enormous difference. As leaders of our companies, of our communities, of our work teams, and our families, from the board table to the kitchen table, and the kitchen table back to the board table, every one of us is making leadership decisions every single day. I don't know if any of you ever read the book Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. I remember reading it in college, and it was so stunning to me because the book, Lord Jim, has this fantasy that he's going to be this great leader. And I'm sure that many of us have fantasies like that. But as the reader, you see him being tested every day, and you see him failing those tests. He's got this idea that defining himself is somewhere out there, some great day when some big thing happens, rather than realizing it's the other way around. It's the little decisions that we make every day that somehow help us to be allowed and empowered to make bigger and bigger decisions. And you're going to be building culture. And you will have a big impact on the culture. And you don't have to be a CEO to have an impact on the culture. You're impacting your roommates. You're impacting people now. I'll tell you a quick story about culture. At Carlson, we have a credo. Wherever you go, whatever you do, do with integrity. Wherever you go, go as a leader. Whomever you serve, serve with caring. Whenever you dream, dream with your all. And never, ever give up. And we actually had tactics around each of those things. What does integrity mean in our environment? What does leadership mean for us? What does serving mean? We're in the service businesses. What does caring mean? Innovation comes from the dreaming. How do we put innovation and dreaming, and how to be better, and continuous improvement? And how do we fight back and hang in just one round longer than the other guys, which often is the definition of winning. So we talked about that. I taught it in China, I taught it in India, I taught it in Germany, I taught it in France, and then 9/11 came. And suddenly, as I drove to our headquarters, I heard about the towers coming down. And I'm sure you remember, none of us knew, is this the beginning of a world war? I mean, there were moments where we didn't know what was going to happen next. We heard about the towers, we heard about what was happening at the Pentagon. And so as I got to the company, my mind was racing about what to do. How was I going to, could I even reach all these people around the world who were responsible for, whom I was responsible for, but who also were responsible. So I called for a telephonic bridge. I got a bridge. We got people all around the world on a global call. Not all the people, but the key leadership. And I said, we don't know what's going to happen next. Anything could happen. So all I can do is tell you, I believe in you, live by the credo, make decisions by the credo, and these are the priorities. First, take care of our own people and their families if we can. Second, take care of our customers. Third, take care of our competitors' customers. Carlson Wagonlit is a very big competitor of American Express, and American Express was in the tower. So we had the kind of connectivity that could help their people who were stranded around the world. And fourth, take care of your communities. And then whatever decisions you make, we'll stand by you afterward. And I just knew. I knew because I knew those people all over the world that they wouldn't let us down. What I didn't know was how amazingly creative they would be. They turned a fabulous ballroom in New York that was near the towers into a station for all the workers. They went and found generators when no one else could find them. They took small amounts of food at TGI Fridays and changed the recipes and made hot dishes and things and made them go for many people. They put beds in Paris in ballrooms because people were stranded. They actually went to people's homes, travelers who couldn't get home, to make sure that their pets were all right or their children. And they even helped because a lot of people were being called up from the National Guard, and they were calling us at Carlson Wagonlit Travel to make their travel arrangements. And then they were saying to our people, what do I do? I can't get into my uniform. And we had to give everybody all kinds of advice. And they did that even though they knew that the skies had been closed and they might not even have a job tomorrow. But if you build that kind of trust with the people you care about and the people you work with, and you count on them, and you believe in them, and they can trust and believe in you, miracles happen. I often tell our people the story that I heard or read about Napoleon because I just love it. Napoleon wanted all the foot soldiers to think of themselves as having a field marshal's baton in their knapsack. Because, he said, when you're on a battlefield, you never know when everybody around you will have fallen. And he wanted them to know that they had that in themselves to pull out that sort of metaphorical field marshal's baton and lead. Every one of us has to think of ourselves that way. Every one of us has to think of ourselves as having that field marshal's baton. So how will we lead? I think you know the answer, at least my answer. We start by leading ourselves. We're the hardest ones because we know this to be true. To be trusted, we must be trustworthy. To govern others, we have to govern ourselves. To bring discipline to our organizations, we have to practice self-discipline. And to sustain, we need to learn to balance performance and stewardship. At the end of my book, I kind of break out of the pattern because the pattern of my life was broken. One morning when my husband and I got a call that our daughter, who was a freshman at Smith, my school, had died in an automobile accident. She was 19. And of course, it's just something you don't even let yourself think is possible as a parent. And you go through all sorts of stages. People send you books, and you'd think if you read about it, that you're going to be angry and depressed and all these different things. You think, well, I'm capable. If I read about this, maybe I don't have to go through these stages. But it's not true. And I had a really hard time with God. I'd had such a personal God. If I had a personal God, how could this happen? If there wasn't a personal God, did it matter? I decided to forget about God. I started reading every philosopher I could read about. My husband and I worked so hard at it. And maybe we kind of let go of God, but God didn't let go of us. And slowly but surely, we started trying to make sense of this. And we realized that this terrible tragedy, that she had no more time. And so for a while, we woke up every day and we just felt it was wrong. She was so young and she didn't have time. She didn't have this day, and we had the day. And so we finally decided that we needed to find a way to remind ourselves to take advantage of that. And so at night, when we pull the covers back, and I want you to think about this, when you pull the covers back, we ask ourselves, if we were an artist and today was a painting, would we step back a few steps and look up and say, that's a great painting, I'll sign my name to it? And some days, we feel really good about the day. We say, today I had a day I could sign my name to. That would be a day where we kind of lived up to our expectations of ourselves. We had been maybe more forgiving. We'd been leaders. We'd stuck to our guns on things that mattered. And some days we just don't do it. We fall short. But the best thing is just the exercise of doing that kind of recommits us to the next day. So my message for you is, cherish every day. Cherish each other. Take yourself seriously. Not so seriously that you don't laugh or have fun, but you can make a tremendous difference. Thank you.
Late, maybe about 2 questions.
Sure.
We'll have 2 quick questions, and then we have copies of her book for everyone to take home with no strings attached this week. Who'll be first? You left them in awe, Marilyn.
Would you consider your style of leadership visionary?
I guess to the extent that if you do something you love and you get really engaged in it, and you really start seeing what's possible. And so to the extent that that's visionary, I think so, because I think as a leader, you need to sort of be able to see what you'd like to have happen. And to the extent that you can make it more and more clear for people, it's easier for them. It's like having a map. And sometimes the leader is a little like the GPS system. People have to come back, and sometimes you really aren't sure how to get there. Often you don't know how to get there, but you get data. I know you're being taught to be data-driven. You get as much data you can. That's why I talk about cross-sectoral, because you need people who can connect the dots. You need to be able not only to see, to present value a business opportunity, but to start seeing, what are the implications socially, what regulations might happen. There's a lot of discussion now about managing risk. The only thing I don't like about that, it's really important. We need to manage risk, but in some ways it's the opposite of having a vision, because if you've got everybody constantly focused on risk, they're not sort of focused on the possible. So you want the possible, you want to identify the barriers and the risk, but they can't be the overall focus, or pretty soon you become just so risk averse that you don't do exciting things and creative things, and you are afraid to fail.
Last question.
How did you prepare yourself to move into a CEO role, and what of those pieces should we be taking away as we enter into this next step of our careers?
I think I was blessed with a lot of, I still am pretty blessed with a lot of energy, but I find that a lot of the interesting things I did were things that I did in the volunteer world as well as the workplace, because that was a place that I started to learn to be sensitive to other issues, to other people. And sometimes in the volunteer world, you can try on, if you're a finance person, they want you to be the finance person in an agency, or a finance person on a board. But try out saying, no, gee, I just as soon I'm a finance person all day, I'm happy to help out if you need me, but what I'd really like to do is I'd like to sort of sit on the marketing committee, because I found that every time I put myself out of my comfort zone, that I learned more things, and then it helped me to sort of have more tools in my toolkit to address the problems, and a wider network of friends, and a network of people that you know. I know Harvey McKay is always talking about his Rolodex, but the fact is that if I were you, I would start. You've got your phone and your computers, so it's really great. Just put those people down with a little note about something you know about them, or where you met them, or what, because you just continue to be surprised how often you're putting together a team and you remember just the right person that you worked with back then. And if you've somehow found a way to keep a record and to keep a little bit of just an occasional high, then you've got that whole network to call on. And sometimes you need to call on it emotionally because you need certain people in your life at certain times. Sometimes it's because you're going into a new market. Maybe I found that I went and studied at the Graduate School of Political Science and Economics in Geneva, and I was the only woman there at the time, and the men were from all over the world. And if you haven't put yourself in any international environment, I do recommend that as because you really need, if other languages, you need to learn to have a sensitivity and to listen to nuance, because you kind of go through a period where first you kind of think, oh, they're so different. Then you go through a period of thinking, oh, everybody's all alike, really. And then you come to a much more sophisticated understanding that we're basically all alike, but that the nuances, the cultural nuances in some of this can provide a richness of diversity of thought, and can actually help us to make better and more sophisticated decisions. So I would put myself in an international setting. I would look at volunteer opportunities to complement what you're doing, even if you're kind of so busy, but just find little places to do that. And then be sure, as we talked, some of us earlier, about be sure to exercise and take care of yourself, because you have to stay healthy. It's a fast-paced, your brain doesn't work well if you don't keep your body working well too. So, but
Marilyn,
thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for such an inspirational talk, and I'm sure the audience will agree. We saved the best for last in the Berges Lecture Series. She has to get away, so please join me in thanking her from the bottom of our heart. And please take a book on your way out.